Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here to hear. Oh, is that you? Okay, sorry. Anyway, I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight to hear the work of our speaker, Dr. Artemis Papatheodorou, and welcome to everyone online as well. I'm particularly grateful to Artemis for giving us her time while she is actually here for a couple of weeks on fieldwork and archival work as part of her 1-year fellowship at the Met in the US. I'm sure many of you know that Artemis is a cultural historian and she works on the Ottoman Empire. She undertook her doctoral research at Oxford on Ottoman central administration, including work in particular on Samos and on Cyprus as well. And her current work, which we're going to hear a bit more about tonight, is the history of archaeology of the Ottoman Empire. Artemis has published very widely on topics including antiquities in exile, Ottoman Greek refugees, trauma, and Ionian antiquities, and also on Ottoman legislative records and policy making. She, as I said, is currently at the Met on this 1-year fellowship. And then she is the recipient of a Marie Curie Award, very well-deserved recipient of a Marie Curie Award, which will enable her to be in the US for 2 more years and then another year in Italy working on European legislation on cultural antiquities. Indeed. Artemis, thank you so much for being here. We're really grateful to you for giving us your time when you're such a short space of time here, but thank you very much.
Dear professors, colleagues, and friends, I am delighted and honored to be with you tonight. I'd like to thank the director of the British School at Athens, Professor Rebecca Sweetman, and Fitch Laboratory Director, Dr. Evangelia Kyriadzi, for their kind invitation. Also, my thanks to all BSA staff members, especially Administrator Mrs. Tanya Gerousi, Archivist Mrs. Amalia Kakisis, and Public Engagement and Development Officer Mrs. Catriona Gallagher, who made this talk possible in more practical ways. As the title of my talk reveals, today I will delve into the Ottoman legislation on antiquities. It wouldn't be an overstatement to argue that in recent years, the history of archaeology, in larger terms, has been gaining traction. By means of illustration, we come across studies on the big men and women of archaeology, but also, to paraphrase Alison Mikkel, on those who shovel and remain silent. Provenance research is another increasingly popular topic. Only last year, I was myself part of a provenance research project as a researcher, one that has at its helm the Berlin Museums and the Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations. In the US, where I currently live and work, an increasing number of museums employ provenance researchers, including my employer, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. My own engagement with the history of archaeology takes us back to the early stages of such interest, to the time of my DPhil at Oxford, which I started over a decade ago, or about a decade ago. My thesis was about the Ottoman policies on antiquities with a focus on legislation and its implementation. My presentation today draws on my doctoral work, but is updated with the latest publications on this topic. Besides such secondary sources, my work has been largely based on surviving documents at the Ottoman State Archives, located in Istanbul, and of course, the text of the regulations themselves. Tonight, I will go through all the acts of law that the Ottoman government promulgated on archaeology and that create the mosaic of archaeological heritage protection in the empire in the long 19th century. And to give you an idea of what will follow, the Ottoman Empire promulgated 4 comprehensive regulations on antiquities in 1869, in 1874, in 1884, and 1906, each one replacing the previous one. It also adopted a law on the preservation of monuments, and in the interwar period, just before its collapse, put forth a draft comprehensive law that was never, though, ratified. Will I be able to discuss all details? Of course not. With dozens of articles, some of these documents could be the focus of an entire presentation. So my focus will be on what I believe can help us better understand the essence of Ottoman legal approaches to archaeology. I will thus first investigate the goals that each comprehensive regulation aspired to achieve and why we moved from one regulation to the other. I will then discuss the content of the regulations, the ownership and export of finds, archaeological research, and issues, issues of antiquities protection. It is equally important to turn our attention to how the Ottoman state implemented its archaeological legislation throughout its territories. Coming to the law on the preservation of monuments, I would like to ask the question, is this law really about preservation? I will also look into the last draft comprehensive law and try to understand the purposes it served at the specific historical juncture that it was envisaged. And a bonus, after years of looking into the history of archaeology, I can confidently say that the Ottoman legislation on antiquities was not an isolated event in the world of archaeology in the long 19th century. Therefore, before I conclude, and as we are in Greece, I'd like to try to locate the Ottoman Empire and its regulations on antiquities in relation to Greece. Let me get started with the goals of the comprehensive regulations. The first Ottoman regulation on antiquities, Asara Attika Nizamnamesi in Ottoman Turkish, was adopted in 1869. Based on its preamble, we notice two major preoccupations for the Ottoman lawmaker. The first one had to do with the relative position of the state in the international scene. This was a time when the Ottoman Empire was experiencing a dwindling relative position in world affairs. Aware of its wealth in antiquities and their importance for knowledge, the Ottoman Empire wished to project to the world an enhanced image of itself by regulating the field of archaeology. This could be done especially by creating a museum. And this brings us to the second Ottoman preoccupation, that is the sharing of duplicate finds that could enrich the museum. We understand that the de facto system in place up to that point was to share ancient finds, and especially duplicate finds, between the excavator and the state. However, this system did not work in practice, and the Ottomans were aware of that. Duplicate finds were considered rare and often went undeclared, kept hidden from the authorities. This much undermined the ability of the Ottoman state to build its museum collections. The introduction of a regulation on antiquities was expected to contribute in reversing this. The particular event that triggered the promulgation of the 1869 regulation, that is Hood's excavations in Ephesus and the way he exported his discoveries, confirms the centrality of the debate on duplicate finds in the museum. So, if we are to sum up, for the Ottomans, the first regulation on antiquities was an effort to improve their standing in world affairs by creating those conditions that would allow them to develop a museum collection equal to that of other advanced countries. The issue of developing the museum was also at the core of the reasons that necessitated the replacement of the 1869 regulation by a new one, just a few years later in 1874. In fact, the 1869 regulation was considered inadequate in the effort to enrich the museum and protect antiquities against loss. It is no coincidence then that the new regulation put so much emphasis on regulating excavations, so much so that in the literature it is likened to an excavation circular rather than a law that sets regulatory frameworks as one would expect it to be. 10 years after the adoption of this regulation in 1884, a new one replaced it. Here again, the Ottomans were concerned with enriching their own collection of antiquities at the Imperial Museum, that's the Ottoman Archaeological Museum. They were particularly dissatisfied with what they considered a disregard of their regulation by explorers and the great laxity in the export of antiquities afforded to foreign archaeologists. And it is true that excavators were entitled to a third, even 2/3 when owning the land, of antiquities discovered. After 10 years of implementing this system, the Ottoman state had revised its priorities and now wished for all originals to end up at the Imperial Museum in Constantinople, not any foreign state or private collections. In 1906, the Ottoman government introduced what would be the last comprehensive regulation on antiquities. This time, however, it was no dissatisfaction with the stipulations on excavations, sharing, or export of antiquities that the 1884 regulation contained. With the 1884 regulation, we can argue that the Ottoman Empire had devised a more or less satisfactory to its system for dealing with contenders. So it saw no reason for stricter rules on, for example, the export of antiquities. This is why the 1906 regulation practically reproduced the same concepts and regulatory arrangements in this area. Instead, the main reason the 1906 regulation was adopted was the need to update the administration of antiquities in the empire. This new regulation thus introduced the first clearly delineated Ottoman Antiquities Service. At the top of this new structure, one found the Ministry of Public Education. At its core, there was the Imperial Museum, seconded by a permanent committee. The provincial directors of public education were part of the Antiquities Service at the local level and would act as directors of local museums where these existed. In this new administrative arrangement, there was place even for the customs office. Besides that, other novelties also improved the administration of antiquities in the country. This is, for example, seen in the distinction made in the regulation between a full-scale excavation, a trial excavation, and a surface survey. Overall, the Ottoman legislation on antiquities initially aimed to support the creation of a museum and through it to improve the image of the country abroad. Once the museum was solidly established, the main questions shifted as to what would be the best administrative system for Ottoman archaeology. Now let's have a look at what the four regulations stipulated with regards to the ownership of finds. The 1869 regulation accorded individual landowners full ownership over all finds discovered in their lands. The 1874 regulation marked a shift towards the state ownership of antiquities. It stated more specifically that all underground antiquities to be discovered belonged to the Ottoman state. It created, however, an opportunity for the sharing of finds, but only in case of authorized excavations. For this, it introduced the concept of the tripartite division of finds between the state, the excavator, and the landowner, each of which was entitled to a third of the artifacts. The shift towards greater state ownership was made manifest in the 1884 regulation, which declared that all antiquities belonged to the Ottoman state, including the ones to be found in the sea, lakes, rivers, and streams. On top of this, the 1884 regulation precluded the sharing of finds, even in case of authorized excavations, with the rights of excavators being limited to making copies and drawings. However, the new regulation mentioned for the first time that, and I quote, "the antiquities which may be discovered by accident while digging the foundations of a building or of a wall or of a sewer shall be divided in equal parts between the owner of the property and the government," unquote. Only to add that the Ottoman government had the right to purchase as many of the antiquities of the landowner as it wished. There was also an unclear reference in passing to public auctions of antiquities confiscated or as a result of a court decision. The 1906 regulation practically repeated the same legal arrangement as its predecessor regarding the complete state ownership of finds. The prior acknowledgement of ownership rights by landowners in case of chance finds was not repeated, even though a vague reference in passing to auctions of antiquities as a result of a court decision is to be found. Also, the regulation acknowledged the profession of dealer in antiquities. For this, permission by the Ministry of Public Instruction was required, conditioned on the agreement of the Imperial Museum. And how about exports? In the 1869 regulation, exports were banned with the exception of coin finds. In the 1874 regulation, exports were made possible but required official permission, while the government retained for itself the right to purchase any item to be exported. The 1884 regulation, as well as the 1906 one, banned all export of antiquities. So, be it about the ownership of antiquities or their export, the Ottoman regime over time became more restrictive, making fines the prerogative of the state. This mostly affected foreign archaeologists working in the empire who wished to export their finds and enrich museums in their home countries. Archaeological research was another field that, like the ownership and export of antiquities, the Ottoman state needed to bring under its control. Between 1869 and 1906, it became regulated in an increasingly detailed manner. The 1869 regulation stipulated that official permission was required to conduct an excavation. Responsible for issuing such permissions was the Ministry of Public Education, which could grant them only for antiquities located underground. There was, however, a way for foreign countries in particular to legally circumvent the ministry by applying for permission directly to the Sultan. This codified in the law a pattern which was well known to both delegations in Constantinople and the Ottoman authorities from previous years, and formalized the regular intervention of embassies on behalf of their subjects. Moreover, this seems to point to an attempt by the Ottomans to ease or at least regulate the pressure exerted on them by the major powers of that time that pitted themselves against one another in their effort to conquer the past in the Ottoman lands. At the same time, another stipulation shows that the Ottoman Empire was itself ready to take archaeological research in its own hands. This is confirmed by the inclusion in the regulation of an open call for experts on antiquities interested in conducting archaeological research in the empire on behalf of the Ottoman government and with Ottoman funding. The 1874 regulation confirmed the competency of the Ministry of Public Education for dealing with requests for authorization, this time all requests, precluding any direct access to the Sultan. You may also recall that this regulation brings to mind excavation circulars. It is precisely its 18 articles dealing with archaeological research, 18 out of 36 in total, that's half the law, to which it owes such a reputation. Let's have a more detailed look to a few of them. This regulation, for example, set the maximum duration for a permit to 2 years. It forbade the issuing of permits to civil servants of the Ottoman or a foreign state for excavations within the boundaries of the area of their jurisdiction. It also limited authorization to one place at a time. Moreover, it defined that excavation permits could be issued by the Ministry of Public Education ad referendum to the Supreme Court, that's the Ottoman government. The 1884 regulation essentially maintained the same stipulations as the 1874 regulation regarding archaeological research. And the same holds true for the 1906 regulation that on archaeological research kept intact most of the provisions of the 1884 regulation. In it, though, we do see a more elevated position for the Imperial Museum. For example, in the 1906 regulation, the Ministry of Public Education was no longer required to discuss requests for authorization with the Supreme Court, but instead with the Imperial Museum. A few additions to the 1906 regulation reflect the increased professionalization of the management of archaeology in the empire. Thus, the new regulation went beyond simply requiring the registration of finds into special registries, as seen in the 1884 regulation, to also requesting their deposition at a designated place in the excavation area for safekeeping. Overall, in the case of archaeological research, the excavation circular, namely the 1874 regulation, held a central position in the development of the Ottoman regime on antiquities. And this is contrary to what we notice with the ownership and export of antiquities, in which case, as seen, it is the 1884 regulation that played a key role. Now, if regulating archaeological research, the ownership and export of antiquities primarily reflect an Ottoman preoccupation with foreign activities in the country, the protection of the material remains of the past reveals the Ottomans' genuine interest in and care for antiquities, irrespective of any third-party interest. Already in the 1869 regulation, one can find elements of antiquities protection. This first Ottoman regulation on antiquities banned any intervention to antiquities to be found overground and linked this to punishment according to law. Similarly, the 1874 regulation banned the complete or partial destruction of antiquities, whether in public or private lands, and linked this to the penal code and punishments that included not only the payment of compensation, but imprisonment as well. Both the 1884 regulation and the 1906 regulation included similar prohibitions to destroying antiquities. Yet, the Ottoman state was fast in moving even further in the protection of antiquities, at least I would say on legal paper. Thus, in the 1874 regulation, a clause sanctioned the state to designate public servants for guarding archaeological sites of importance when located in private lands. The 1884 regulation, however, reversed this in what seems to be related to the underfinancing of archaeology in the empire. Therefore, the 1884 regulation created an obligation not for the state, but for individuals and communities in possession of lands or buildings where antiquities were found to preserve them. Also, it introduced another important series of protective restrictions. The regulation banned the construction of lime kilns in the vicinity of ancient sites, raising scaffolding on monuments, removing stones that lay on the ground, even making copies of antiquities or using antiquities as, for example, habitation and for various agricultural reasons. The 1906 regulation echoed its predecessor in protecting antiquities from destruction and harm. Overall, although the Ottoman state showed an interest in protecting antiquities right from the beginning, it was with the 1884 regulation that it established a more solid framework. Now, it is fascinating to follow the Ottoman efforts to manage antiquities in the empire. For the authorities in Constantinople and the provinces, this was a time of shrinking borders, limited finances, and a lack of technology that could facilitate effective control over the empire's every little corner of archaeological significance. One therefore should not expect a seamless and smooth implementation of archaeological legislation. Instead, in spite of efforts, law enforcement could be erratic and inconsistent. But let's have a better look at it with the use of specific examples. The greatest challenge related to the 1869 regulation was that it formally introduced for foreign petitioners a system for authorizing archaeological research that bypassed the Ministry of Public Education and relied on the Sultan's decision. This stipulation is castigated in literature, but I argue that it also created a window of opportunity for the Ottomans to introduce standards, processes, and practices more advantageous to their interests than the ones the regulation afforded them. Archival sources document the addition, thanks to the Sultan-based system of monitoring excavations, sharing fines, and imposing time limits to permits that otherwise would have been harder to enforce as the regulation did not refer to them. The 1874 regulation provides a mixed picture as to its uniform implementation. The archival record documents instances when the law was strictly followed and others when it was shown little consideration. Individuals applying for permission to excavate acknowledged the law. For example, in 1878, writing on behalf of Mr. Freshfield from London, who wished to excavate in Ephesus, we see Ephesus here on one of the pictures, Mr. D'Alessio from Constantinople explicitly mentioned that Mr. Freshfield would be willing to accept the necessary stipulations. In line with the regulation, the petitioner even made sure to include a rough sketch of the prospective excavation location. The authorization given to the German heir to the throne in December 1874, allowing him to conduct excavations in Pergamon and the surrounding area, confirms that the Ottoman authorities valued the implementation of the new law. Not only did they follow its spirit and letter, but were also able to impose stricter rules than the ones envisaged in the regulation regarding the sharing of fines. So instead of a tripartite division of ancient artifacts, the Imperial Museum was entitled to all discoveries, while the German prince was only allowed to make copies. However, following the law was not always the case. When foreign policy considerations weighed heavily in decision-making and colonial powers engaged in fierce competition for antiquities in Ottoman lands, then bypassing the 1874 regulation could actually be seen as the only way through. This is what we notice in the case of the authorization provided in 1879 to French Consul de Sarzegue, who wished to conduct excavations in Mesopotamia. By addressing their petition to Foreign Minister Papatheodorou Pasha, the French from the beginning neglected the regulation which invited all interested parties to acquire authorization by submitting their petition directly or through the local authorities to the Ministry of Public Education. The tone of the petition was formal, yet the French ambassador did not fail to include a personal invocation to the minister to kindly inform the Sultan of the French request. This invocation confirmed the attempt of the French legation to ignore the role of the Ministry of Public Education, which a letter written later that summer clearly expressed by highlighting the need to avoid the, and I quote, bureaucratic formalities. Also, it confirmed the wish to frame the authorization process as a foreign policy issue to be dealt with from the beginning at the ministerial level, and by this I mean the foreign ministries of the two countries. This is reinforced by the explicit request for equal treatment with Great Britain, which a few months earlier had been granted permission to excavate throughout Mesopotamia in the name of Sir Henry Layard. As for the text of the authorization to Consul de Sarzegue, this contained a number of clauses that contradicted and others that upheld the 1874 regulation. For example, the fact that permission to excavate was granted to the French consul in Basra was in dire contrast to the regulation which forbade public servants of foreign governments, such as Consul de Sarzegue, to excavate within the area of their jurisdiction. Similarly, de Sarzegue was allowed to excavate throughout Mesopotamia, whereas the regulation stipulated that authorization could be provided for research limited to a village or town. On the other hand, in line with the regulation, de Sarzegue's excavations were conditioned on the consent of the landowner in the case of private lands. Time does not allow me to delve into all authorization clauses in detail, but one cannot fail to notice that overall, the regulation was followed only on issues of lesser importance to the French, who wished to excavate in as many locations as possible and secure as many finds as possible. For the period introduced with the 1884 regulation, the archival records allows us to reconstruct a similarly varied picture as to the implementation of the regulation. Without arguing that the regulation was completely neglected, budgetary issues hindered the effective monitoring of sites and undermined the collection of ancient artifacts. A recent article that relies heavily on the archives of the Imperial Museum, themselves only recently and incrementally made available. If you're interested in them, they are now available, but in small numbers, shows that Osman Hamdi Bey, the Ottoman director of the museum, resorted repeatedly on a strange barter deal with the German excavators at Zincirli in return for their paying the freight costs to transport antiquities from the site to the museum in Constantinople. He was willing to allow them to keep a part of the finds. Another major challenge was combating illegal digs and the flourishing black market in antiquities in the vast expanse of the empire. Theodore Macready, whom we see here, commissary at the Imperial Museum, argued from Raqqa that the entire population, from the Kaimakam and his last employee to the gendarmerie and everybody else, was involved in illegal excavations and trade in antiquities. Significantly, he spoke of thousands of holes from illegal digs within the city walls and of his complaints to the representative of the Kaimakam about an illegal dig which he had personally witnessed being met with indifference. Illegal digs and traffic in antiquities were complemented by the use of ancient sites as sources of reconstruction material by local populations. Significantly, the use of ancient slabs in construction was a well-established pattern of recycling building material and a tradition that dated back hundreds of years. This might explain Makridi's firmness, when confronted with such cases. In a letter to Halil Bey from 1904, Halil Bey was the vice director of the Imperial Museum, he urged that, and I quote, "It is absolutely necessary that I go to Notyon, Gavurköy or Christianköy, this is to the south of present-day Izmir, to see what is going on there. The priest of the village, Papa Dimitri, together with a certain Dimitri who is a vakil, a representative of the church, and a grocer named Stathi, were digging to get stones required for building a new church." Unquote. Indeed, this long-standing tradition could have dire consequences for monuments. In a letter dated in 1902, Theodore Makridi spoke of the quarry of Kanawat in present-day Syria and Soweida in Hauran, also in present-day Syria, which the Druze would visit in order to select the stone slabs that suited their needs, remove entire sculpted gates, and break sculptures into pieces. Occasionally, other profitable activities followed the destruction of a site and the removal of its stones and sealed its fate. For example, in the port of Kaitan in the province, the Vilayet of Aleppo, a plot of land by the sea was put up for sale by the local authorities, but only after the antiquities on it were either removed by the locals or destroyed and the land was abandoned. High politics also played an important role in undermining the proper implementation of the 1884 regulation. The way that Sultan Abdulhamid II exercised his prerogatives in those years illustrates this well, with geopolitical considerations weighing heavily in bypassing the 1884 regulation. Thus, for example, the foreign policy objective of harnessing good ties with Germany and Austria-Hungary resulted in neglecting the Ottoman archaeological legislation in the case of the excavations at Ephesus. Similarly, a secret agreement with Germany, signed in 1899, provided for the equal sharing of finds between the two countries, contrary to the regulation that, as we've seen already, stipulated complete Ottoman ownership. However, when the geopolitical interests of his country were not at stake, the Sultan was more willing to heed the advice of his administration in charge of antiquities. After 1906, all themes continued to have a significant impact on the implementation of the new regulation. For example, the Sultan would again not shy away from bypassing the regulation when confronted with pressing foreign policy issues. In 1906, he thus granted the Germans the right to export half of the finds from their excavation at Miletus. Illicit digs and traffic in antiquities continued to cause major headaches to the Ottoman authorities. Let's have again a look at Raqqa. Surviving documents exchanged between the governor of Aleppo, the Imperial Museum, the Ministry of Public Education, and the Ministry of Interior allow one to follow illicit activities regarding antiquities in the province of Aleppo, and in particular Raqqa, after 1910 and up to the outbreak of the First World War 4 years later. These documents reveal a recycling of arguments about the need to protect antiquities and the inability of the state authorities, be they attached to the central government or local administration, to do so. Estimated at a few 100,000 liras, illicit traffic in antiquities in this province was a major source of income for locals who engaged in it, as we see on the archives, and I quote, on a rather vast scale. Illegal digs could go on for days in a row and involve many people, as the following excerpt from a telegram sent by the Kaimakam of Raqqa and quoted in a document illustrates. For the past 3-4 days, wrote the Kaimakam, many locals, even women and children, go to the ruins of Raqqa to look for antiquities, and it has been made known that they have stolen objects of considerable value. The inability of local law enforcement forces to intervene was beyond doubt. In Raqqa, the Kaimakam argued that the gendarmerie had turned a blind eye and taken no measures against these unlawful acts, as undoubtedly had been happening for years, because of its forces being numerically insufficient. Indeed, an incident described by the Governor-General of Aleppo, Hussein Kazim, in December 1910, shows that looters would at times go as far as to use violence against the gendarmerie and engage in serious fighting. When one takes into consideration the expanse of the province of Aleppo, the difficulties of traveling in its desert and reaching its many remote places that in the document studied are characterized as being away from civilization, the challenges that local authorities were confronted with become clearer. While evading the issue of increasing the capacity of the gendarmerie, the local authorities insisted on the appointment of guardians to archaeological sites and ruins. In contrast, the Imperial Museum considered local government fully responsible for law enforcement and in particular for not giving way to illegal digs, for arresting and bringing to justice those who acted contrary to the regulation on antiquities, for getting hold of finds, and for preventing any damage to antiquities. Also, the Imperial Museum considered it impossible to conduct excavations in all, and there were many, places of archaeological importance in the vast territorial expanse of the empire, and that it was beyond its means to appoint guardians in all sites. So, with the Ministries of Public Education and Interior acting as messengers, the Imperial Museum and the local government in Aleppo engaged themselves in an unproductive exchange of arguments that appeared to aim at persuading the other side to do what it considered impossible. Although while doing this, the Ottoman administrative elite at the central and local levels showed itself aware of the issue at stake and of various limitations in addressing it, it also made manifest its inability to work out a feasible and effective solution. Now, I've promised to share some information also on the regulation and the preservation of monuments, the Muhafaza Abidat Hakkında Nizamname, that was adopted in 1912. Already its first article linked this regulation with the 1906 regulation on antiquities, which it practically complemented. The 1912 regulation covered all fortresses, towers, and city walls, and in general, all edifices, irrespective of their period of construction, as described in Article 5 of the Regulation on Antiquities. The second article introduced a complete prohibition regarding their destruction. Did it? We'll see. This article confirmed the links with the 1906 regulation on antiquities, but by stating that violators should be punished according to the regulation of 1906. Article 3 of the regulation on the preservation of monuments set the geographical scope of this law, which covered the provinces and stipulated the formation of provincial committees comprised of a civil servant, a representative of the military, the engineers of the Ministry of Public Works and the municipality, and of employees of the local museum under the local director of education. According to Article 4, these committees would be responsible for providing the authorities with documentation about the monument proposed for demolition. Documentation should include a plan and a section of the monument, as well as additional information drawn from local sources. This should accompany the report of the committee prepared for submission to the office of the governor. However, the decision was not to be taken at the local level, but in the Ottoman capital. The report and its annexes, if any, would be sent to the Ministry of Education, which was required to consult with the Imperial Museum, so the museum again. In case the monument in question was of paramount importance, the museum would appoint a specialist from its ranks to conduct a site visit. In this decision-making process, the Ministry of Education was accorded the final word. Before a decision was made, no one could proceed with the demolition of the monument in question, or they would be held responsible according to law. Article 5 of the Regulation on the Preservation of Monuments created a window for those exceptional cases where an imminent threat to the surroundings of a monument could be verified and the documentation and decision-making process described in Article 4 could not be concluded. In such a case, the local government was responsible for handling the dangerous situation in consultation with its engineer or other knowledgeable person. Yet, as also mentioned in Article 5, the local government was responsible for salvaging what decorations and inscriptions it could by removing, without causing any harm, the ones on stone, and by taking pictures or making drawings of the ones painted on plaster, or by getting hold of their shapes in other ways, and for letting the Ministry of Education know of the situation. According to Article 6, these rescued decorations and inscriptions would have to be preserved at the local museum or be sent to the Imperial Museum. So, as perhaps already noticed, the 1912 Regulation on the Preservation of Monuments focused on ensuring their preservation by creating checks and balances for their demolition. It introduced a request for documentation, moved decision-making from the local level to the central level, and tied the entire process to scientific expertise, especially that of engineers and museum staff members. Moreover, it introduced the idea of rescuing heritage through documenting monuments and even removing parts of edifices. This regulation confirmed that Ottoman archaeological management put at its service scientific knowledge such as engineering and technology, as for example photography, and had come to the point of valuing the documentation of a monument. However, the fact that this regulation put emphasis on the conditions for the demolition of a monument, without acknowledging a need for proactive preservation, including restoration, points to the scale of demolitions affecting historical edifices in the empire, rather than the practice of preservation. Be it due to the derelict state of monuments, their limited usefulness, or the need to provide for modern facilities, the early 20th century ushered in great challenges for heritage protection. Significantly, a document which was produced only a few days after the draft regulation on the preservation of monuments on the 6th of August 1912 and made reference to it, highlighted the financial profit attached to clearing space occupied by monuments. Signed by Grand Vizier Ghazi Ahmed Mukhtar, it mentioned that, and I quote, "As written in a reply by the Ministry of Finance, the said fortresses and walls that in no way possess any value and importance from the viewpoint of history and the arts, and what remains of them can have no imaginable use, would be demolished, and their ruins and plots be left to the local municipal offices for sale." Unquote. I would like now to move to the last act of law that the Ottomans drafted with regards to antiquities. In 1921, during the Allied occupation of Constantinople, and while the Ottoman state was faced with the danger of becoming obsolete, the Ottoman authorities in charge of antiquities pushed for the adoption of a new law. The draft law of 1921 combined in one text the regulation of 1906 and the regulation on the preservation of monuments adopted in 1912, while introducing amendments to the former. The draft law made reference to an Office of Antiquities that would play the role of the Antiquities Service without, however, describing its organization. Significantly, it was the first law text to define antiquities chronologically by setting a date, the 17th century, after which artifacts would not qualify as antiquities. Unlike these amendments that fell within the lines of previous legislation while introducing important but rather particular improvements, the provision that acknowledged excavators a share of the fines and their export signal a radical shift in the Ottoman regime on antiquities. These latter additions should not strike one as peculiar. The 1921 draft Ottoman law on antiquities was drafted as a result of the signing of the Treaty of Sèvres that was signed in 1920, which stipulated in Article 421 that, and I quote, the Turkish government will, within 12 months from the coming into force of the present treaty, abrogate the existing law of antiquities and take the necessary steps to enact a new law of antiquities, which will be based on the rules contained in the annex hereto. Unquote. So the aforementioned annex spoke precisely of portage and the right to export antiquities from the Ottoman Empire. Although Halil Bey, then director of the Imperial Museum, complied with Article 421 and accordingly produced a draft law in line with the relevant content of the Treaty of Sèvres, this law was never ratified and put into effect. Actually, the 1906 law continued to be in effect in Turkey until 1973, if I'm not mistaken, quite late in time. Now, so far we've seen the goals and key content of Ottoman archaeological legislation. Yet, the Ottoman Empire was not the only country in the world to develop archaeological legislation in the long 19th century. It would be impossible to compare it with all other countries that did, but since we are in Athens, it is interesting to see where it stood in relation to its neighboring Greece, another major source country of antiquities. A comparison with the archaeological regime of Greece shows that the Ottomans were in a position to benefit from Greek legislation. Significantly, Ottoman interest in the way the Greek kingdom managed its archaeological affairs was not new and focused on the challenges that foreign activities pose, as well as archaeological heritage protection. As early as 1875, the Ottoman government had expressed its interest in the Greek case when the Grand Education Council, while discussing potential modifications to the 1874 regulation, took seriously into consideration the conditions for excavations that the Greek kingdom has stipulated. Although the workings of this council were inconclusive, Greece continued to serve as a model for the Ottoman state. In his speech at the opening of the tiled pavilion, the Çinili Köşk, a new building of the museum, in August 1880, Minister of Public Education Munif Pasha made recourse to the Greek case for, and I quote, "At present, even though they spend large amounts of money for archaeological research in Greece, European states do not transfer antiquities to their countries, and the finds are preserved in Athens." Unquote. More than this, specific provisions of the 1884 regulation were actually based on the Greek law of 1834. Article 5 of the Ottoman Regulation of 1884, which dealt with the protection of monuments, was to a large extent a translation of Article 85 of the Greek law of 1834, except for paragraph epsilon. Thus, both laws banned landowners from destroying monuments, ancient roads, etc., that were located on their properties, and forbade the construction of lime kilns within less than 250 meters from a monument. Also, they prohibited landowners from executing any kind of activity around a monument, if that could cause harm or damage to it, from removing stones from the ground where antiquities were found, and from erecting scaffolding on monuments with a view to measuring them, sketching them, or for other similar reasons. Finally, they forbade the reuse of antiquities as habitation, depots for watering animals, etc. For the first time, an Ottoman regulation on antiquities attempted to put an end, in a targeted manner, to all economic and scholarly activities that posed a risk for a monument, and in doing this, it used the Greek law of 1834 as a source. And with this, I would like to thank you all for your attention. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.